Okay, this is John Mark versus Karthik. E4, John Mark's white. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6. This is all fairly good. Um, when I played E5, I continued with knight C6 like Karthik's doing. So yeah, I played this from both sides. Here, what I played as white is bishop B5, and a lot of times black will continue with A6, and most white players will kind of retreat with the bishop, but I thought it was a lot better to take this knight because it kind of disrupts black's pawn structure and it leaves this pawn really weak. Although you can't immediately, hold on, you can't immediately take this pawn because he could do something like queen d4. But if you castle now, you really got a threat there. And these pawns are a little awkward on the queen side. But a lot of people play bishop c4, which is also fine. And if you're going to do this, really, try to be aware of the threat of some kind of attack against f7, because that's kind of the idea with bishop c4. And Karthik played knight f6, which is okay. Jean-Marc played knight c3. And here, Karthik played bishop c5. That's okay. Similar idea to bishop c4. Another idea you might want to try is knight takes e4. And yeah, he'll take your knight, but now you have d5, forking those. And so you do get your material back there. But bishop c5 is probably a little better. And white now played d4, and that's obviously a mistake. You don't want to just lose that pawn. d3 would have been better, or just castle. Probably do both of those. d4 not so good. Is it better now for black to take the pawn with the knight, the bishop, or the pawn? Well, probably look at all of those. If he takes with the knight, problem is the knight's defending e5, so then white will take on e5. So I don't like taking the knight with the knight at all. If you take with the bishop, then his knight will take your bishop. So I don't really like that either. And so that kind of leaves e takes d4, which was played, which attacks his knight. And that's probably the best move. And white really has two options here. He's got to move his knight. Either come to a4, attacking the bishop, or come to d5, where the knight's defended. Instead, Jean-Marc, you played e5, and it might look kind of equal because you're both attacking a knight. But the thing is, when you take black's knight, his queen's going to come out, and that's going to be an advantage with his queen right there. So d takes c3, e takes f6, and Karthik doesn't even need to immediately recapture with his queen. He's actually a little better at castling, because if you try to continue with f takes g7, he's got rook e8 check. So after he castles, you really need to castle. And now he comes out with the queen. And that's definitely better for black, all this pressure along that diagonal. Karthik just took immediately, though, with the queen. And now white, probably what you need to do is try to counterattack against the queen. Bishop g5 is a pretty good move. And he's got to have to move his queen to probably g6, d6, queen of... Queen of 5 is probably the best square, because it's defending f7, it's attacking g5, and it's attacking c2. But, I mean, then white can play queen e2 check. But, yeah, this position is definitely better for black because of the strong black queen. And there's still this pawn sitting right there. Yeah, so bishop g5 is probably the best thing you can do here as white. Bishop h6 is no good. No good at all. I mean, really, he's just going to take your bishop, John Mark. And he doesn't even need to take it right away. Probably the best way to do that is c takes b2, threatening the rook. The rook moves, and then take the pawn. And he could take with the queen, but I think it's a little better to take with the pawn for a couple reasons. One reason is the queen's just really happy right here. It's not going to be doing as much over on h6, and also the idea is after h6, maybe this rook will come here, and the king can castle queenside. So yeah, bishop h6 is bad. Triple question mark. And Karthik really should have taken it. Instead, he played queen e7 check, which it's weak because it allows white to sort of fix his mistake. You can block the check by moving the bishop back to safety on e3, and that certainly would have been better. But for some reason, nobody seems to care about that bishop. And John Mark just played bishop e2. And I mean, that's just not as good. Not only are you still leaving your bishop on h6 hanging, but your bishop on c4 was at least, trying to do something. Now on e2, you've really got two bad bishops. And Karthik now starts taking material. C takes b2. Rook has to move. And now, Karthik, you really should take the bishop. Instead, bishop b4 check was played. And once again, that allows white to sort of recover. He should have played the bishop back to d2, where it's a lot safer than on h6. Instead, king f1 was played. And I mean, if you really look at this, Karthik, I think you'll agree, g takes h6 is the best move. Take that bishop. It's better to take his bishop than to defend your pawn on b2, which is what you did with bishop c3. And now it seems you guys just kind of quit paying attention, because John Mark now plays bishop takes g7. Much better would have been to play the bishop back to safety there on d2. And on g7, I mean, this is just horrible. The bishop can just capture, which is what Karthik should have played. Instead, he played rook g8. And now, John Mark, you can take his bishop on c3. But for some reason, neither one of you really saw that. And so John Mark just plays back to h6. And now Karthik continues with d5, which is, I mean, that's good, opening up the line for this bishop here on c8. And that's good, even though white can just take the pawn on d5. Because after bishop e6, now that a2 pawn is going to be threatened. And so that's really what black probably should have played now, is bishop e6. And white might have tried queen b5, attacking the undefended pawn on b7, but castle queenside. And then he might have played queen a4 to try and defend on a2. But this is really interesting here. Probably the best move for black is rook g4, but another almost as good move is actually rook g2. And the reason why is because if he takes it, now you have rook g8 check. And if he falls back to king f1, you got checkmate right there. So you can actually sack a rook on that side, which is kind of the idea of g takes h6 earlier. So yeah, bishop e6 would have been good here to put pressure on a2. Instead, Karthik played knight b4. It's kind of okay, but not so great. And it's not so great because as John Mark played, you can play the queen back to b3, and it's sort of threatening all three of those. So the knight on b4 is not really doing a whole lot. Mainly because that bishop is undefended. And maybe even queen c4 would have been a little better, but it's not a big deal. Queen c4, queen b3. And so black really needs to do something about the undefended bishop on c3. And probably the best thing that could be done is play queen f6, because not only does it defend the bishop, but it also attacks that undefended bishop on h6. Instead, John Mark played queen c5. And so the bishop's defended, but there's no threat against h6. And so that sort of leaves white with the initiative because he doesn't have to defend the h6 bishop. And a really good move here that John Mark played is now bishop c4, putting a lot of pressure on that diagonal. And white's winning right now because of that. And probably the best thing that white could have done is simply get his rook off of g8, because if when the bishop takes f7, there's going to be a fork. So maybe rook g4, which sort of forces white to move his bishop, but he moved their check, and then the king moves. Now maybe h3 attacking the rook again. But at least black gets his rook off of g8 there. And instead, black played bishop e6, which just doesn't work at all because bishop takes, f takes, queen takes, and now, black's got some real difficulties. Probably what you needed to play here, Karthik, is queen e7, although that doesn't help you very much. At least gets your queen next to your king to avoid checkmate. Instead, you played a king d8, and that opens up the idea of rook d1 check. And there's still this queen takes g8, but that rook's not going anywhere. If you have a piece you can capture and you don't need to capture it right now, then capture it later. Try to find something a little more aggressive, and rook d1 check certainly is a move like that. After rook d1 check, then you can take the rook on g8 later. But John Mark just immediately took the rook. It's still very good for black. And now Karthik played king e7. Try to remember that you're trying to get away from your opponent. You know, he really is threatening queen f8 check, and so king e7 is not going to really help. King d7 would have been slightly better, but both moves are still losing. King e7, and right there you can just take the a8 rook. And now John Karthik played a queen c4 check. And king g1. And here Karthik took on a2. But I mean, it's only a pawn. It's not going to help you that much to take that a2 pawn. Probably a better move would have been knight d5 for a couple reasons. One, if your king will have to slide over to d7 after queen f8, it sort of blocks the check along the d file. And the other idea is when the knight's on d4, well, I guess that's really the only idea. Black's definitely losing this, but at least with knight d5, you got a little more protection for your king. If you just take on a2, now what white should have played is rook to d1, because now there's a very strong checkmate threat against black. You know, rook d1, he can promote to a queen, but he still loses. Queen f8 check, king e6, knight g5 check, king e5, f4 checkmate. So yeah, rook d1 was pretty good, sort of boxing the king in. Instead you played, really, you're a little too defensive here, John Mark. You don't need, there's no reason to play rook f1. There's no threat to the f2 pawn at all. And so Karthik now is essentially given permission to go ahead and promote to a queen. But White's still winning this. White's winning because he's got those two rooks that he captured, and Black's king is still really exposed. Queen f8 check was good. King d7. And now it's a little complicated, but you should be able to, you know, have a series of checks here against the black king that wins. For example, queen f5 check, king c6, queen e4 check. Might try to block that with knight d5, queen e6 check, king b5, queen e2 check, king a5. And at some point you really have to take that extra black queen. So rook takes, queen takes, queen f1. He might take another pawn. And if you look at this, basically what you've done is you've gotten rid of the second black queen, and you've gotten the white king safe, and white has an extra rook. So white should win this. So it's really just a matter here of giving some checks, moving his king out of position, and then finally essentially getting your queen to a position where it can then come back and support your king. Sort of went like this, queen f5, queen e4, queen e2, like that. And then once all that's done, white's kind of winning here. Instead, though, what is the point of knight e1? This is a queen right here. This is a rook. Queen's better than the rook, so you definitely want to capture that. You don't want to go into this hyper defensive mode and play something like knight e1 that just does not work at all. Bishop takes e1 makes a lot of sense. And now black actually has two queens. Before, you could have killed one of them, but now he's actually got two of them. And so that's a real problem. Maybe something like h4 here. Kind of gives the idea of, you can get this rook up here, or you could play the king here to h2. Played g3, followed by what happens here after knight takes c2, queen g7 check. I'm not really sure. So right here, he takes with the queen, but might have been a little better to take with the knight. And I think big main reason for that is now the knight's defending the bishop, so now this queen is free to move. And also, when the queen's on a2, it's controlling f7, kind of keeping your position a little safe. But when it slides over to c2, that allows white to play what he did, which is queen f7 check. And the king's gotta have to move. It really needs to play king d6 and try to, come over here to safety. After king d8, there's a checkmate right here. Bishop g5 check. And the king's going to have to move over to c8, and then the queen's going to come right there on e8, checkmate. Bishop g5 check, king and queen e8 checkmate. So king d8 was definitely a mistake. It's pretty much an even position right now. White's up two rooks, but black's up a knight and a queen and a pawn. But after king d8, there would have been checkmate. Instead, John Markey played queen f8, and that allows him to sort of bring his king back up to d7 and escape from this. There's queen f7 again, and now he plays king d6. Bishop f4 check is okay. Bishop f8 check is okay. He played, I probably would have played bishop f4 because it kind of gets more pressure against c7, but he played bishop f8, that's fine. King c6. Now maybe here queen e8 check would have been good. And the reason why is because once you play queen e8, not only are you checking his king, but you're also hitting this bishop here. And so your rook's going to be able to recapture after he moves. You can't really do that after queen f6. And kind of the idea here is to get onto the e file with a check so you can take that bishop. Now he plays king d5. Jean Marc, you really need to get your king away from this bishop and queen. So king b5 would have been a lot better than king d5. You don't want to leave your king sitting in the center of the board. And this gives white, more checking opportunities. Queen f7 check would have been good. Bishop g7 check, king c5, queen e7, and then there's that same idea. As soon as you can, you want to check the king in a way that also allows you to recapture on e8. Instead here you played queen f3 check, and queen f3 check loses. And the reason it loses is because it allows black to interpose his queen right there. And once black does that, essentially the game will be over. All he's got to do is get his queen next to his king so it can actually defend his king. So queen e4 would have been really good. And so he played king e5, still sort of is leaving his king in the center of the board. Maybe here king g2 would have been good. Getting some pressure there along that rank. So he played a bishop g7 check, king e6, queen f6 check, king d5. Once again, this would have been good. Queen e5 check, threatening to recapture on e8 or e1. Instead, you played queen f3, and that once again lets black play queen e4, trying to trade off the queen and leave him with his king in a rather safe position now once the queen's gone. But instead he played king c4. King g2 makes sense again, sort of to activate that h rook. Instead, white played queen f4 check, and this isn't so good because once again queen e4 is how black can really defend and get his queens into the game. But he didn't do that. He played king d3, and king d3 loses. There's another checkmate right here. Queen d4 check. He's got to move to e2. Queen e3 check. He's got to move to king d1, and rook takes checkmate. So definitely queen e4 was better than king d3. But white played queen f5 check, king c4. And John Mark, you do not want to trade queens. You know, these two queens right here aren't really doing anything. Your queen is like the only piece that is doing anything. So you don't want to trade your good queen off and then he's still going to have a queen in the game. Much better would have been queen e6 check, because there's that check, plus you're going to be able to recapture on e1. But you took his queen, he recaptures. f4 is no good. You're really opening yourself up along this diagonal. h4 would have been a lot better. And now black can play queen b6 check, king g2, queen c6 check, king h3, knight e3, and the idea with knight e3 is actually now that king is stuck over there, plus that rook's under attack. And yeah, that you can just take your bishop, but then there's queen e6, king h4, queen g4 checkmate. So f4 is not good. Black played a5, I guess trying to get a second queen again, or a third queen. There's f5. Suppose white's trying to get a queen. Here, black still has the idea of queen b6 check, and maybe prepare that first with knight e3, which really sort of leaves the white queen boxed in. You know, if he had played, I don't know, h4, that won't work, but um, what doesn't work at all here, though, is bishop f2. Like, that just loses the bishop. Yeah, knight e3 would have been better. Bishop f2 loses the bishop. And now queen b6 still looks really good. Instead, he played knight e1. I think we saw this in the Sam and Eric game. That leaves the knight really weak, and it's pinned to the queen. Try not to put knights in front of your queen like that. Knight e1, there, the knight's dead. Blackie had such a good position, and you just sort of let him take all your pieces. Here, notice that pawn's undefended, so queen f5 check would have been good. And so you played queen c2 check. And after like king e3, white's probably winning this. The pawn is still undefended, so black can take it, but then there's rook c1 check. And with two rooks and a bishop, white's position is better here. And the idea with king e3 was, if he doesn't take this pawn, which he didn't, then maybe the king can come up here and actually defend the pawn. But, well, I guess he does take the pawn, but it does. Anyways, yeah, king e3. It's better than king f1, because king f1 leaves your h-rook really stuck with nowhere to go. And it also allows queen f5 check. King e2. Here, queen g4 check would have won, attacking the king and the undefended bishop. Instead, he played queen e4 check. And now, John Mark, you really need to not bring your king this way over, because his king is right here. You want to keep your king away from his king, because that is how he checkmated you, and that's really the only way he could checkmate you here, is to use both his queen and his king. Queens can't checkmate really on their own, so you don't want your king next to other pieces that can help the queen. King f2 would have worked, and you would have been okay. But after king d2, now you're dead. Queen d3 check, king c1. Right here, black could have just immediately played king b3, which is really strong. There's no need to play a4. And in fact, a4 sort of lets white get back into the game, because he can play rook hf1. And now if king b3 is played, rook f2 helps defend along that line. And so now we're back to the situation where white has a queen, but with these three pieces, white should be able to win this. So a4, don't make unnecessary pawn moves. I keep saying that, and it's true. There's no need to promote that a4 pawn when you can just, play king b3, threatening an immediate checkmate. Unfortunately, instead of rook hf1 to defend along the second rank, John Mark played bishop b2. The bishop on b2 is not really doing anything that it wasn't already doing on g7. So there's really no reason to move it. I guess you were trying to stop a3, but if you really look at it, that's not going to stop a3 anyways. That queen's going to support it. So there's really no reason to play bishop b2. And the real threat that you needed to see here was king b3, which now checkmate is pretty much forced. And it happens very quickly right there, like that, checkmate.